The battles fought in Stalingrad, Kursk, and on the banks of the Dnieper dragged thousands of young people into an environment where mud, shrapnel and death became routine. Many of them disappeared without leaving a testimony, while others returned unable to explain with words what they had seen. Among the few who did so in detail, without hiding what hurt, was a soldier from the 66th Guards Rifle Division, who fought prone as an infantryman and mortar gunner, crossing step by step the bloodiest settings of the conflict. His voice, far from the slogans, reconstructs from within the moments that others prefer to forget. What kind of scar does an experience that almost no one manages to tell in full leave? Youth under the smoke of war. Mansur Abdulin was born into a working-class family in western Siberia, in an environment where factory smokestacks were part of the daily landscape and heavy labor defined the rhythm of life. His childhood was spent within a simple community, where the days were marked by the schedule of the mines and the sound of metal hitting the ground. There, from a small age, he learned to live with scarcity, family discipline, and an atmosphere where collective commitment was stronger than any personal desire. His father, like many others, worked in harsh conditions that seemed normal to everyone, and his mother raised him amidst domestic chores and an almost automatic patriotic education, where every daily gesture was wrapped in the sense of duty. As he grew up, school became much more than a place of study. Not only were mathematics, history or geography taught, but the classroom also served as an extension of state ideology. In every corner, posters reminded everyone that the enemy was lurking and that the young Soviet must be ready to defend his homeland. The heroic biographies of soldiers, workers and pioneers were narrated in a solemn tone, and Mansur absorbed that information as a natural part of his education. Stalin's speeches were broadcast through loudspeakers hanging in the classrooms, and civil defense exercises were practiced as if they were just another subject. Thus, barely noticing it, he formed a very concrete idea of duty, loyalty and sacrifice. During his adolescence, while some children still dreamed of games or adventures, he had already started working in the local mines. There, between the dust and the constant noise, he understood that the hardness of life was not learned in books, but in direct contact with the earth. Returning home covered in soot, he saw his mother look at the horizon with resignation and his neighbors comment on the radio news with growing concern. The war had not yet reached their area, but it was felt in the atmosphere, in the glances, in the way people bought provisions or talked in a low voice about what was happening at the border. In that environment, enlistment was not just an option, it was a kind of moral mandate. Almost all the young men of the village volunteered without hesitation. The girls gave them flowers or embroidered handkerchiefs when they left, and the neighbors bid them farewell as if they were already heroes. Mansur, who had barely crossed the age of majority, began to feel growing pressure, not only because of the expectations of his surroundings, but also because of an internal voice that told him he could not stay behind. In one of his testimonies, he summarized it clearly. "I wanted to go to the front because all real men went to the front." The decision to join the army was received by his family with a mixture of pride, resignation and fear. His mother did not say anything, but her silence weighed more than any word. His father, on the contrary, simply nodded his head, as if he had known for a long time that this day would arrive. By then, Mansur had already assumed that leaving home was part of the path expected of someone like him. And so, with a small suitcase, a few documents, and the firm conviction that he must do the right thing, he left for the recruitment center. Throughout the train journey toward his military destination, he observed other young men like himself, all with tense and nervous expressions. Some sang patriotic songs to lift their spirits, while others remained silent looking out the window. Mansur didn't say much, but he remembered every image that passed before his eyes. The endless fields, the half-empty villages, the stations where mothers cried without wanting to let go of their sons. On that journey, he understood that the entire country was changing, that the war was not just a distant conflict, but a reality that touched every corner, every family, every personal story. When he finally arrived at the training center, his life took a complete turn. The instructions were sharp, and there was no room for doubt. The food was scarce, the cold seeped through the walls, and sleep barely lasted a few hours. Everything revolved around preparing them for the front, and every mistake was punished with shouts, extra marches, or physical punishments. However, far from being demoralized, Mansour adopted that routine as part of the process. There he met comrades from different parts of the country, men who spoke with different accents but shared the same uncertainty. Quick friendships were formed, born of necessity, and a sense of camaraderie that grew stronger with each day. In parallel, the instructors constantly insisted on the idea that the motherland was more important than life itself. It was repeated in the training sessions, in the nocturnal talks, in the posters that decorated the corridors. The new soldiers were instilled with the idea that they should not fear death if it was useful for the victory of socialism. And Mansour, although he did not say it out loud, began to believe it, not because he was naive, but because in that context, to refuse was seen as a betrayal. From civilian to Red Soldier. From the moment he received the notification, there was no turning back. That folded paper handed to him marked the start of a new stage, although inside he still felt more like a boy from the provinces than a combatant in training. He walked to the station in his daily clothes, an old coat and a bag with the little he could carry. The platform was packed with young men like him, many with the same mix of pride and confusion. No one knew exactly what to expect, but everyone was clear that their obligation was to obey. Upon arrival at the destination, they were lined up and assigned a number. The formalities were quick. Within hours, he was wearing a rough uniform and boots that were not his size. The instructions were dry and repetitive, with constant shouting that left no room for doubt. On his face, as on many others, exhaustion, anxiety, and that internal spark that had not yet completely faded were mixed. The first contact with military life was a frontal blow. The facilities were basic, the mattresses thin, and the cold seeped in without asking permission through the wooden cracks. The schedules were strict, formations at dawn, endless physical exercises, and then the theoretical classes where they were taught about tactics, discipline, communist morale, and hierarchy. It was not just about learning to shoot, but about becoming part of a much larger machine. Each day ended with exhausted bodies, wet feet, and half-empty stomachs, although no one said it out loud. Mansour didn't take long to notice the change. At first, he still maintained a certain enthusiasm, especially when holding a rifle for the first time. That gave him a sense of importance, as if he had finally earned his place among men. But that excitement faded quickly. Using the weapon meant carrying its weight all day, cleaning every metallic corner under rigorous inspections, and learning to disassemble it in seconds. As the weeks advanced, his body became more resistant, but his mind began to understand that war had nothing to do with propaganda posters or patriotic speeches on the radio. The training included combat drills, movements in the snow with full loads, and sessions where they had to throw themselves to the ground repeatedly until the skin on their elbows cracked. They learned to use grenades, dig trenches, and follow orders without questioning them. The slightest mistake could result in a sanction, a humiliation, or, in the worst case, an injury that would remove him from the process. Many complained in silence at night, when the lights went out and thoughts were louder than snores. What seemed like heroism turned into fatigue, cold, and orders, he would later say. In his battalion, there were men from different regions with accents, customs, and ways of understanding life that sometimes clashed with each other. Some were peasants who had never left their village, others students who left university to answer the call of duty. Friendships were forged quickly, almost out of necessity. In a short time, they shared personal stories, pieces of bread hidden in their pockets, and advice on how to calm their hunger with hot water and cookie crumbs. Meanwhile, the instructors kept repeating that they would soon be sent to the front. Every mention of that word provoked a dense silence. At first, the idea of fighting against the German invader aroused anger and a desire for revenge. But when letters started arriving with news of casualties in other detachments, the atmosphere changed. Some tried to write home, but they did not know what to say. Others preferred to remain silent and focus on surviving day by day. The night before the transfer to the front, the tension was so palpable that some could not sleep. The flashlights turned on in silence, the trembling hands preparing the backpacks, and that last moment of quiet before the true chaos. Mansour sat on his cot, with his rifle on one side and his coat over his legs, and thought about everything he was leaving behind without knowing what awaited him on the other side of the train line. Heading for hell, the Volga front. With barely 20 years old and his uniform still new, Mansour put his backpack on his shoulder and climbed into the wagon that would take him to the heart of the war. He did not say goodbye out loud, he simply entered without looking back. The journey began amidst patriotic cheers and promises of glory, but in the wooden wagons only silence reigned, along with the smell of wet earth and the tense breathing of the new recruits. They travelled together, but each one travelled with his own fears, clenching his teeth, swallowing his doubts. The train advanced slowly, crossing rusty stations, burned villages and empty fields, while inside, the official songs mixed with the stories that circulated by word of mouth. There were soldiers who claimed to have heard that the front was lost, that the Germans did not take prisoners, that the wounded were rotting alive on the battlefields. No one knew for sure, but every anecdote ignited one more spark of anguish. The dry cold of September seeped through the cracks in the walls, and with every kilometre further south, the atmosphere became denser, quieter, more serious. During one of the forced stops, they got off at a half-destroyed station, with the tracks full of overturned wagons and charred skeletons of military machinery. Mansour did not say it out loud, but he felt that the world he knew was ending. "I had not seen a dead body until that moment," he would say many years later. On the platform lay bodies covered with tarps, with footless boots sticking out, and bandages stained with dry blood. A group of military doctors passed by, already accustomed to that sight. No one paid attention to them. He did look, and by looking, something changed forever. The convoy continued advancing between distant detonations and columns of smoke that rose on the horizon as if the sky were burning from within. In its wake, the villages had broken windows, tank tracks in the mud, and lone women carrying barefoot children. Many of the new soldiers covered their eyes to avoid seeing through the wooden gaps, others clenched their fists in silence. Mansour watched everything, every detail, every sign that the destiny awaiting him was not a parade, nor an opportunity for heroism, but a sentence without warning. Upon reaching a disembarkation zone, the wagon stopped abruptly. The order was to get off quickly, check the terrain and await instructions. Hundreds of soldiers were piled up, all with tired faces, malnourished, covered in dirt, without helmets, without jackets. They were coming from the front. The new recruits looked at them like ghosts, and Mansour was no exception. One of them approached, dragging a poorly bandaged leg, and told him, "Good luck, kid." From here on, there's no turning back. That phrase stuck with him. The makeshift camp where they would spend the night was full of shouts, cigarette smoke, and badly yelled orders. The dust from the boots mixed with the smell of gunpowder that no longer went away. Mansour couldn't sleep. Near the bonfires, fragments of prayers were heard, whispered stories of how the previous units had fallen, of how some had mistakenly died under friendly fire, of how no one knew if they would still be there the next day. Someone said that in Stalingrad they were recruiting everything that breathed. It was the beginning of the end, and they were arriving as relief. Although no one said it, everyone knew they were being sent to a slaughterhouse. The next morning, when the trucks arrived to take them closer to the line of fire, the silence was absolute. The engines roared, the dust covered everything, and the officers called roll without looking anyone in the eye. In the vehicles, Mansour shared space with boys like him, some peasants, others mechanics, all transformed into soldiers without having fired a single shot. They didn't speak. They only breathed in sync with the rattling. The landscape became gloomier with every kilometre. Charred trees, open craters in the earth, abandoned trenches, corpses that no one collected. There were crows on the telegraph wires, and that was more disturbing than any shout. A distant explosion made the truck brake. Upon getting out, they heard the first real shots. Not practice shots, not training shots, but direct fire. The enemies were not visible, but their presence was felt like a dense shadow enveloping the forest. Some new recruits vomited from nerves. Mansour did not. He stood still, rifle in hand, trying to remain calm. That night they slept on the damp earth, taking turns to stand watch. At dawn, the first thing he saw was a line of stretchers. On them, bodies covered with dirty blankets. One of them had an arm hanging that moved with the wind. He was young, very young. In the following days, the route to the front became more erratic. There were not always roads. They advanced on trails between hills and marshy areas, crossed rivers without bridges, and got lost in forests without signs. The maps were useless. The orders were contradictory. One officer assured them they should wait, another that they should continue without stopping. In the midst of that chaos, some comrades began to speak softly about deserting. Mansour listened to them without intervening, but deep down he already knew he would not run away. Although he didn't understand why, he was clear that he had to live through what was coming. Finally, they reached a high area from where the Volga could be seen in the distance. On the other bank, columns of smoke and the ruins of what was once a city were visible. "That is Stalingrad," a sergeant said, pointing with his chin. No one answered. They stood looking at it as if they could not believe that this was their destiny. The baptism of fire in Stalingrad. From the moment the train stopped on the outskirts of the city, it was clear that they were already in an uncontrolled zone. There was no station or welcome sign, only uneven ground covered with trampled snow, wooden debris, and empty wagons lined up as if they had been forcibly abandoned. They got off without waiting for any formal order. No one greeted them. No superior showed up to organize anything. They only saw columns of smoke rising on the horizon, mixed with the constant vibrations of distant explosions. An unreal heat floated in the air, as if the ground itself were breathing fire, and every breath they inhaled seemed to carry ash. The newcomers were given some loose cartridges, a piece of hardened bread, and the instruction to follow a poorly defined path between rubble and disturbed earth. There were no clear signs, but everyone knew where to go. The route was marked by bodies half covered by snow, recent boot prints crossing without a pattern, and destroyed vehicles covered by torn tarps. The silence of those returning from the front was even more disturbing than the roar of the bombs. Stretcher-bearers passed without speaking, carrying wounded men with distorted faces, while others simply walked alone, as if they no longer knew where to go. One of the boys in the group asked if that was already the city because he didn't see buildings or streets or anything recognizable. They replied that they had been inside for a while, that this was Stalingrad, even if it didn't look like it. Everything had been razed. The remains of what were once homes or warehouses now formed irregular corridors, open spaces without logic. Nothing remained standing beyond some door frames or cracked walls. The sergeant guiding them yelled at them to duck and speed up. At that moment, a nearby explosion kicked up a cloud of dust that blinded them. Several fell to the ground. No one understood where the impact came from. They only knew they had to move. The protagonist crawled to a fallen wall and stayed there, with his face against the frozen ground. It was then that he felt for the first time that fear was not something that passed. It was something else, something that settled in the body and never left. From that point on, every step required a new effort. The physical exhaustion wasn't the worst part. It was the weight of what could happen in any second. After reorganizing the group under what remained of a metal structure, they were assigned an urgent task: advance toward an elevated position from which access to a key intersection was controlled. There was no time for detailed instructions. They were only told to follow in single file, in silence, and avoid any unnecessary movement. During the journey, they crossed what were once streets. Now they were corridors between ruins, with broken beams, cracked walls, and fallen ceilings. Among those remains, they knew there could be hidden enemies. And there were. An isolated shot cut short their march. One of their own fell forward without making a sound. Another received a shrapnel wound that tore his arm. Upon reaching the marked point, they were integrated into a unit holding out inside a partially standing factory. There was no introduction. A non-commissioned officer handed them used rifles, a box of ammunition, and helmets stained with dry dirt. Everything smelled of dampness, old oil, and stale blood. Inside the building, the floor was covered with rags, rubble, and pieces of decomposed food. Some men slept sitting up with their backs against the wall. Others cleaned their weapons without looking at anyone. Most did not speak. Outside, the day remained grey, but inside everything was darker, not only due to the lack of light, but also because of the dense silence that filled everything. Shortly after, a sharp whistle ran through the place. It was the signal. Everyone stood up without saying anything. They positioned themselves behind columns, bricked-up windows, and broken corners. The enemy appeared through the long corridor that led outside. First, they were shadows moving fast, then shots erupted. The protagonist felt himself pulling the trigger without thinking, shooting by reflex. The weapon's recoil hurt his shoulder, but he kept pulling. Beside him, a comrade fell to his knees. His gaze was fixed and his mouth was slightly open, as if he were trying to say something that never came out. The battle lasted more than 1 hour. No one knew exactly how long. Only that when the partial retreat was ordered, not everyone was still there. They took advantage of the withdrawal to move the wounded toward a back room, protected by a rusted boiler. The place was safer, but it offered no relief. Smoke continued to enter through the holes in the walls. Dust clung to their skin like a new layer. While dragging the fallen, one of the protagonist's comrades, with whom he had shared training in Siberia, was hit in the abdomen while trying to help a more severely wounded man. The officer shouted for them to leave him behind. There was no way to evacuate him. They could only cover his wound with a rag and keep moving forward. They saw him raise his hand, but no one stopped. At the end of the day, upon returning to the factory, nothing was as it had been. Those who remained were covered in dry mud with torn uniforms, sunken eyes and rigid hands. No one spoke about what had just happened. They sat in any corner, shared half-open cans, and tried to smoke cigarette butts recovered from the floor. One urinated behind a metal plate. Another stared at the ceiling without blinking. Everything seemed frozen, except for the smoke, which kept rising as if it had no end. They slept in shifts, 2 hours at a time with the rifle between their legs. They took turns keeping watch. The enemy could return at any moment. No one trusted that the pause would last. Outside, the sky was still covered with that perpetual grey that made it impossible to tell if it was morning or afternoon. The city no longer had a shape. There were no reference points, only rubble, dust, a sour smell, and that constant noise that did not come from a single source. It was as if the city itself was breathing with difficulty, and that breathing was what set the pace for everyone who was still there, waiting for the next combat without knowing if they would see it through completely. Among the dead, routine of horror. The routine inside the ruins became a monotonous succession of scenes where the dawn announced nothing new, only confirming that one was still breathing amidst frozen corpses, broken beams, and a dense air that barely allowed one to advance a few steps without running into something that had once been human. Each day began the same, with the sound of footsteps on layers of frost, with the stench of bodies half covered by bricks, and with a silence that was anything but peaceful, barely interrupted by brief orders or some distant explosion. The bombardments did not cease by night or day, which turned any shelter into a risk. The ruined houses did not serve as a shield, and the poorly dug trenches collapsed with the impact of the projectiles. As the bodies accumulated at the edge of the positions, they ceased to cause a reaction. No one covered them, no one moved them. Some still had their eyes open and their skin white as plaster. With time, they stopped looking like people. They were just passed by with downcast eyes, without stopping. To withstand the cold, most wrapped themselves in whatever they could find: torn jackets, borrowed scarves, burned blankets. Even so, nothing was enough. The water turned into ice inside the canteens, the gloves hardened, and the fingers quickly became clumsy. More than one woke up with numb feet, and some did not even realize they were wounded until they tried to walk. That is why many slept with their boots on, knowing that taking them off could render their feet unusable. Meals were sporadic. Sometimes they did not arrive. When there was distribution, they received tiny portions of moldy bread, stale fat, or old cans that smelled bad even before opening them. Some chose not to touch them, others devoured them, knowing there would be no other chance. Hunger was already a part of the body, like fatigue or grime. It was not spoken of, but everyone felt it. In moments of pause, if they could be called that, some would approach burned-out embers just to remember what warmth felt like. Their breath froze in the air, and many had stopped talking. Sentences were short, only to point out something urgent or to prevent a fatal error. No one had the energy for stories or for small talk. The severely wounded usually remained where they were. If there was no way to move them, they were left with a little water and some extra clothing. It was known that they wouldn't last long. Some dragged broken limbs, others screamed until their voices faded. Helping them was a luxury that could cost another life. Sometimes, in the middle of an attack, someone decided to end a comrade's suffering with a bullet. It was a silent act. None of them commented on it afterward. Cases of mental imbalance were not uncommon. Some soldiers stopped talking. They didn't react even when the walls shook. Others laughed non-stop, even with open wounds or bloody hands. There were those who went out without coats, talking to themselves, as if they were somewhere else. The commanders did not know what to do. If they were enlisted men, they were sent to the rear if they were lucky. If they had rank, they tried to get them back to the front before the rest realized their condition. The use of morphine was common. Syringes circulated from hand to hand among nurses and soldiers who knew how to apply them. Some asked for it to relieve the pain, others to pass away without so much suffering. It was also used to sleep when fear prevented them from closing their eyes. No one asked why it was used. It was only noticeable who started to depend on it when they requested it more often. Distrust was part of the atmosphere. Some stole gloves from the dead while they were still warm. Others traded cigarettes for a piece of bread. The rules no longer resembled what was learned in the barracks. The only thing that mattered was reaching the next dawn, finding a thicker wall or a helmet without cracks. Conversations were limited to the essential. No one asked where the other came from or talked about the town they had left. Remembering became dangerous. Sleeping, too. No one took off their coat or their rifle. They slept wherever, on broken planks next to sunken stairs or among the rubble, always with an alert ear. Some covered their eyes to avoid seeing the flares, others their ears to avoid hearing the groans of the wounded. But everything was heard just the same. The young ones, those who had been there for less time, showed a different kind of fear. They came from weeks of instruction with clear exercises and orders, but in Stalingrad there was no form or logic. Positions changed every few hours. A building taken at dawn could be in enemy hands by nightfall. Fighting took place floor by floor, hallway by hallway, in dark corners where the enemy could be 3 steps away without anyone noticing. The fights were at close range. They shot almost hand to hand. They used grenades, rifle butts, bayonets, or whatever was at hand. Sometimes bodies were dragged just to take cover behind them. There was no time to think. The one who hesitated did not last. The casualties accumulated. Every day someone disappeared, and with them any notion of a group. No one knew which unit they belonged to anymore. They only followed whoever shouted the loudest or seemed to know where to go. No one asked for explanations. Macabre jokes became frequent. They laughed about the condition of their boots, the color of their soup, the mice that ran out from between sandbags. It was a way to keep going without thinking about anything else. The laugh, brief and dry, served to expel the tension, if only for seconds. The smell of the field could no longer be distinguished. It was an indefinable mixture that permeated their clothes and pores, as if everything was saturated with something old, damp and burned. At first it made them dizzy, then it became part of the air. Only the new recruits showed a reaction. The others kept walking with a lost look, unperturbed. Letters arrived from time to time. Some read them without understanding, others kept them unopened. It wasn't that they didn't want to answer, it was that there were no words. How to explain that the world they came from no longer existed? Writing became useless. Sometimes silence covered everything. No bullets, no shouts, no engines. But it wasn't reassuring. They knew that after these gaps the worst was coming. If nothing was heard, it was because something was approaching. And then everyone stayed still, waiting. The days continued like this, without schedules, without certainty, only with the fixed idea of resisting, of not falling today. Tomorrow would be another story if it came. Resist or die, the endless battle. The day that marked a before and after for Mansour began the same as the previous ones. Bursts of fire crossing back and forth, explosions that shook the frozen ground, and careful steps among twisted remnants of what was once a city. They were advancing through an area they already knew, now turned into a corridor of loose bricks, rusted wheels, and destroyed furnaces. There were no warning signs, no indication that a blast would collapse him in a matter of seconds. While crossing between 2 charred walls, an unexpected discharge hit him on the side. He felt the impact, a pressure that doubled him over without warning, and then nothing more than the hardness of the ground. He couldn't move. He could barely make out the shouts of his comrades returning fire, not noticing that he was no longer standing. He saw figures crossing in front of him, and with an instinctive effort, he raised his arm. One of his own saw him, threw himself down next to him but didn't say anything. The shooting continued. When the intensity of the combat subsided, they removed him like other wounded, taking him between 2 people and dragging him along a side path. There was no stretcher, only a dirty tarp used for dragging. His uniform was soaked, the fabric torn and mixed with mud and black particles. Upon reaching a safe point, they tore his coat and applied a hurried bandage. He screamed but barely recognized his own voice. No one explained anything. They put him in a vehicle with violent jolts at every bump. At some point, he lost all notion of where he was. He woke up in a temporary medical post. It wasn't a hospital. It was an adapted shed where bodies were lined up on wooden cots or directly on the floor. A nurse removed the initial bandage and checked the wound without reacting. Then a doctor arrived who barely touched the affected area, whispered something he didn't understand, and ordered an injection. The liquid caused immediate dizziness. He didn't know if it was morphine, only that the pain suddenly dropped. The rest of the place seemed to spin slowly, and his head sank into a heavy fog. 2 nights passed in that space. There were no mattresses, only planks with thin blankets. No one spoke to the wounded unless necessary. Human contact was brief. They offered him something warm to drink and sometimes a bowl of soaked grains. The dressings were quick, without words. In one of them, the nurse pressed so hard that blood came out again, but she did not apologize. She just placed another dressing, secured it with strips of cloth, and moved on to the next one. On the 3rd day, they loaded him onto a closed truck. Several bandaged soldiers went with him, some unable to speak. No one asked how the other felt. The road was a constant rattling. At the next stop, they were transferred to a hospital train. The car was adapted with narrow bunks. At least there was some warmth. 2 nurses were in charge of everyone, applying injections and noting down data. One of them spoke to him. She asked if he was in pain. He nodded his head. She administered a dose and told him they were taking them to the northern hospital. She promised nothing more. During the journey, some died. No one reacted. They just moved the bodies to a corner. The windows showed snowy ruins and empty towns. The atmosphere was heavy, not only because of the confinement, but because of the certainty that not everyone would arrive. The train advanced slowly, stopping in the middle of nowhere. Sometimes the weeping of a wounded person was heard, but most were silent. When they arrived, they were taken down one by one. Mansour was taken to a common ward, where men with similar injuries lay in neat rows. The doctor who examined him touched the injured area, indicated a simple treatment, and asked for tests. There was no technology or detailed diagnoses. The method was basic: clean, bandage, and endure. Near him there were soldiers with mutilated bodies, with evident infections, and with nervous breakdowns. The nurses came and went without stopping. One of them, younger, stopped for just a moment longer next to him. They didn't talk much. On one occasion he asked if he would return to the front. The answer was brief: "That is not for us to decide." Nothing more. There were no phrases of comfort or promises. In that environment, no one expected them. One day, during the cleaning of the wound, a doctor commented that the damage was not irreversible, but that it required time. "It is not the worst I have seen," he said, as if that were enough to reassure him. He accepted it without responding. He spent the hours lying down, looking at the plank ceiling and listening to constant moans from those who shared the room. Sometimes he counted his own breaths to check that he was still there. During one night, he heard 2 orderlies talk about rationing. If supplies did not arrive, they would reduce the food. The next day, breakfast was smaller. No one protested. It seemed that everyone took it for granted. 1 week later, they reported that some would be transferred. No one explained where. He was loaded onto a truck again, surrounded by bandaged faces and motionless bodies. This time, he also remained silent. He did not know if the place they were going was better or worse, but he understood something clearly. If he had survived until now, it was not because of strength or faith. It was only because, for some reason, it was not his turn yet. A bitter return to the front. After weeks of recovery, when his wounds had barely closed and his body still showed signs of weakness, Mansour was unceremoniously reclassified onto the list of available soldiers. Still adapting to the subdued rhythm of the hospital, he received the notification without explanations or farewells. He was given back the same coat he had worn when he entered, and with no additional belongings, he was put on one of the trains that carried the recovered men back to combat, this time heading south. The wagon was full of men who did not speak to each other, and if someone shared a ration, they did so in silence, without gestures of gratitude. No one knew where they were going, but everyone understood what it meant to return. During the journey, the stations became increasingly small, and the structures more deteriorated. The train windows showed sterile fields and houses half demolished. No one asked anything, as if the names of the places no longer mattered. Upon reaching the disembarkation point, they were made to advance for several hours along uneven roads where snow mixed with dry mud. They passed by dead animals, skeletons of disabled vehicles, and structures ruined by old explosions. The landscape did not seem new, but it also offered no clear references. Seeing ruins no longer surprised them, nor did finding abandoned bodies provoke a reaction. His new unit belonged to a completely different formation. The officers showed no interest in his origin or asked about his previous experience. He was assigned a weapon, shown his position, and integrated with the rest without further ceremony. No one mentioned his past in Stalingrad or his time in the hospital. He was simply one more number on the list. Most of the recruits were newcomers with still intact faces and empty gazes. The orders were brief, repeated in a low voice, and obeyed without question. The operational zone was different from anything he had known. It was a rural region with isolated houses, scattered trees and deteriorated roads. Defences were assembled with whatever was available: mounds of frozen earth, broken posts, and fragments of materials collected along the way. There were no tall structures or solid positions. Enemy snipers hid on the edges of the fields, and every advance required crawling for many meters. At night, the sound of the wind was confused with distant engines, and no one tried to identify where they were coming from. In the first confrontations, the company suffered casualties without managing to identify the attacker. The shots came from uncertain sectors, and the bursts seemed to emerge from the terrain itself. It took them days to adjust their manner of movement. During one of the patrols, they found a hut recently used as an observation point. Inside, there were still warm food scraps and handwritten documents. A soldier threw a notebook into the fire without anyone saying anything, and the group continued its march toward a wooded area. Mansour felt no fear, nor curiosity. He only advanced when ordered and stopped when someone raised their hand. The relationship among comrades was sparse. Some talked about unimportant things while cleaning their boots or fixing their gear. A couple asked about his scar, but upon hearing the word Stalingrad, they did not insist. During the nighttime transfers, Mansour did not evoke emotions, barely recalling procedures. The cold was no different from what he had already felt, but the surroundings were. There were no buildings, no basements, no narrow streets, only open fields, low hills, and small patches of trees where observation points were improvised. In a brief skirmish, one of the new soldiers collapsed. He knelt in the middle of the advance and began to mutter. They took him off the path, and he was not spoken of again. In the group, the mental exhaustion was visible. Some stopped eating, others isolated themselves even though they shared a shelter. The youngest aged in days, and silence became part of the uniform. Mansour no longer tried to get to know anyone or tell stories. He only counted bodies at the end of each day. One morning, a superior officer visited their position, inspected the rifles, noted something, and left without comment. Shortly after, a new order was received: move to a nearby hill to gain visual advantage. The ascent was slow and rough, with men stumbling or losing their balance without receiving help. At the summit, they improvised a defense with branches, stones, and frozen earth. Mansour was assigned to a watch with another soldier who didn't speak, but who knew how to distinguish movements in the undergrowth. Days later, the enemy artillery began to attack with intermittent fire. There were not many casualties, but the pressure forced the company to change location. The new position was more exposed, but it allowed for better communication with nearby units. Mansour was assigned early morning rounds, with long shifts where the wind seemed to cut right through the coats. He did not complain, nor did he ask questions. He simply did his part. At the end of the month, an urgent call came over the radio. A nearby section was being attacked during a retreat. Mansour's unit was sent as reinforcement. They ran along an unstable path until they reached the designated area. The fighting continued. In the midst of the chaos, he saw a wounded soldier shouting for them to leave him. One of the medics applied pressure to the wound, while another dragged him to the side. Mansour kept going. He positioned himself with the others and fired until dawn. The other hell, crossing into Germany. As the Soviet offensive continued its course, the unit Mansour was in began to notice subtle changes in the environment. Wider roads, straighter posts, signs that no longer used Cyrillic, and villages with more steeply pitched roofs. There was no exact point that indicated the crossing into Germany, but everyone understood they had crossed, confirmed by the way the few inhabitants who appeared watched from afar without uttering words or gestures, as if they did not know whether to fear, hate, or simply resist in silence. The instructions were different from the previous ones. There was no longer talk of caution or inspections. The orders were broad, sometimes vague, but they conveyed a clear idea: advance without restrictions. Some soldiers began to search houses without waiting for approval. Others took utensils, opened cupboards, and helped themselves to warm food if they found it. No one said anything. The chain of command allowed it, or at least did not prohibit it. It was whispered that everything that belonged to the enemy could be taken without guilt. Mansour still did not say a word. Around him, new recruits joined the platoon, many still not knowing how to use their weapons well, with disoriented looks when reading signs in German or hearing voices in a language that sounded distant to them. In the pockets of fallen enemy uniforms appeared notebooks, photographs or transit permits with unfamiliar stamps. Each finding was a reminder that they were penetrating a country that had been at the origin of all that destruction. During a patrol day, the Soviet soldiers intercepted a group that surrendered without offering resistance. There was no interrogation or classification. They were told to step off the road and nothing more. They remained standing by a fence until the platoon left. The indifference was total. The enemy no longer generated the same tension. Now what was urgent was to keep advancing. At a rural intersection, a white-haired woman slowly approached with a container in her hands. One of the non-commissioned officers stopped her with a push without looking at her. No one reacted. Only the instruction to keep pace and not be distracted was heard. A few days later, upon arriving at a small, semi-destroyed train station, a charge placed beneath one of the platforms exploded. Mansour was thrown several meters, his left leg opened by metal fragments. Two comrades threw themselves onto him and dragged him behind a derailed wagon. With pieces of belt and improvised bandages, they managed to stop the bleeding until a medic arrived. The first aid post was a roofless house adapted with the bare essentials: broken mattresses, wooden boxes, water in buckets. A nurse, her face semi-covered by a dirty cloth, asked his name while searching for an ampoule among stained rags. They injected him with something that clouded his thoughts, and then left him on a board next to other wounded who were waiting for transport. Shortly after, he was transferred without explanation to a makeshift medical center. In the medical center they arrived at, the soldiers were divided into groups according to the severity of their injuries. Mansour was placed in a secondary room, where the wounded waited seated or lying on the floor. Time passed between muffled moans and brief orders shouted from the doorway, until a doctor finally appeared without warning. His leg was examined, and with basic tools, an intervention was performed without full anesthesia. He was then taken to a small room, where another 5 men shared a barely lit space. The days repeated themselves without variation. Bandages were changed in the morning. In the afternoon, roll call was taken. There were no visitors, no news from the front, and no explanations. Some spoke among themselves, most did not. The perception of pain became increasingly diffuse. Mansour began to notice that he no longer reacted to shouts or sobs, or even gestures of desperation. He just observed without getting involved. One morning, one of the inpatients began to tremble. He writhed uncontrollably for minutes until 2 orderlies removed him. No one asked his name. The next morning, his bed was empty. Mansour knew he had seen him before, probably in transport, but he could not clearly remember him. Days later, they transferred him again, this time to a more organized facility near a partially intact city. The journey was longer, with multiple stops to pick up wounded who were piled up without distinction. In the new ward, they placed him on a metal bed under a broken window. The blankets were rough, the ceiling had cracks, and the smell of disinfectant mixed with wood smoke. The routine was equally monotonous: quick checkups, scarce food, and cleaning shifts that no one wanted to fulfill. A nurse offered him a bowl of watery soup and a piece of bread. He accepted it without looking at her, without thanking her. The sound of spoons hitting the tin plates marked the only moment of the day with some movement. With time, some were discharged, others arrived in their place. The rotation was constant, and no one knew anyone. Mansour did not speak with the newcomers. He limited himself to listening to the footsteps, the slamming doors, the short instructions. The rest of the day was spent lying down, staring at a crack in the wall. Finally, a doctor informed him that his condition was sufficient for re-enlistment. A new destination would be assigned to him as soon as the paperwork arrived. Mansour nodded once. He said nothing more. He did not ask about dates, conditions, or his leg. He knew that it did not matter. He would return to wherever they sent him, with whatever was left of his body. He did not expect to heal, only to continue until something at some point stopped him. End of the war, but not of the trauma. The war that had consumed entire years was beginning to close, and rumors about the end reached the hospitals where the wounded awaited signs. Mansour remained in bed, with his leg covered by bandages, hearing snippets of talk between doctors and soldiers that confirmed what had been so awaited. The Red Army was already in Berlin, and the Germans were yielding ground. The word victory circulated through the hallways like a ceaselessly repeated whisper, but for many of those hospitalized there, that term no longer meant the same thing. When the triumph was officially announced, the hospital erupted into movement. Some soldiers who could move improvised a celebration in the courtyard, waving red rags and singing amidst muffled laughter. The loudspeakers broadcast speeches and songs about honor and the future. From his bed, Mansour heard everything without moving a single muscle. He knew that in Moscow the streets would be full of flowers and cheers, but he felt alien to all of it, knowing that he was no longer that young man who had enlisted believing in a glorious return. The doctors toured the wards without enthusiasm, barely informing them that supplies would begin to arrive more frequently. Mansour received a thicker soup and some freshly baked bread, but upon tasting it he felt nothing. Around him, some toasted with badly sealed bottles, others remained in silence, trapped in thoughts more difficult to digest. A nearby soldier, pale-faced, murmured that his brothers had not survived. Mansour did not reply, understanding that this absence was just one more on an endless list. That night, while the bells rang in the distance, his mind only returned to Stalingrad, to the cold, to the explosions, to the voices that had been silenced without warning. Days later, a group of officers visited the hospital with news of the parade in the capital. They spoke of columns marching steadily through Red Square, of enemy flags dragged across the pavement. Mansour listened without uttering a word, trying to visualize that scene, although he did not feel he belonged to it. His march had been another, narrow hallways, the smell of wet gauze, open wounds, and whispered words. For him, victory was in being able to breathe one more morning. In time, he was transferred to another quieter medical center, where they spoke to him about a possible recovery with a cane. He nodded with a neutral expression. While his bandages were being changed, he thought that looking others in the eye would be more difficult than walking again. The war may have ended on the maps, but not in those who had gone through it. When he was discharged, he received a document that confirmed his service and a medal that he put away without ceremony. The journey back was made on a train full of men with visible after-effects. The rural landscape passed before them, with patched houses and clear roads, but inside the wagon, another time reigned. No one spoke. The war continued there, between bandages, lost gazes, and dense silences. Upon arriving home, a difficult atmosphere awaited him. Some acquaintances greeted him without knowing quite how, and his mother hugged him without saying anything. Mansour barely smiled. He walked the streets he had known since childhood, but he no longer felt a connection. Everything seemed alien, as if it were a distant scenery. He tried to rejoin civilian life, first in simple tasks, then in a workshop where he couldn't stay upright for too long. He heard others talk about new beginnings, but his thoughts went in another direction. When someone mentioned the word peace, his mind replied with images of trenches, medical wards, and endless nights. He slept little and poorly, and often woke up startled, believing he was still under attack. Sometimes he ran into old comrades in the city. No words were needed to recognize each other. The way they walked, the way they avoided crowds, or the way they stood still upon hearing a sharp sound was enough. Some shared painful stories, others preferred to remain silent. Mansour listened to them carefully, though he only said what was necessary, and sometimes he let out, "I came back, but I am not the same." In an official event organized by the local government, he was invited to receive another medal. He accepted it in silence and put it away next to the previous one, in an unlabeled box. He never wore either of them. He didn't need symbols because the memory was within him every second. Time passed, but the images persisted. Every loud noise frayed his nerves. He avoided crowds. His mother, worried, tried to cheer him up with conversations about family or stability, but Mansour barely responded. He couldn't find words to explain the weight he was still carrying. Some childhood friends had disappeared, Others returned with faces so different that they could barely be recognized. Mansour visited relatives of the fallen, helped with what he could, and left flowers in silence. He understood that cities could be rebuilt, but people could not. Little by little, he began to write fragments. He didn't seek to tell his story, only to record what appeared in his mind during the long nights. He filled notebooks with names, loose phrases, brief scenes. He didn't show them to anyone. It was his way of organizing what he still didn't understand. The book spoke of victory and resistance. The squares filled up every anniversary. At some of those events, Mansour watched from a distance as young people marched, dressed in new suits. He did not intervene. From his corner he saw something else, not parades but absences, not music but echoes. And although he walked among others, he knew that inside he remained trapped in that winter that never ended. The memory that never rests. The years that followed the end of the war brought no rest for Mansour. Although the conflict had officially concluded and the country celebrated victory, for him every day became a silent prolongation of what he had lived through at the front. The hospital was the first setting of that new life, a place where time passed between slow healings, medical checkups, and the endless wait for his wounds to mend enough for him to stand on his own feet again. There he met other men who, like him, had been irreversibly marked, some without arms, others without legs, many with their eyes dimmed, even though their bodies still breathed. This coexistence showed him that the return to normality would be an impossible path. After several weeks in the hospital, he was declared fit to leave the institution. He was put on a train along with other wounded soldiers, where everyone had a lost look in their eyes. To earn a living, he accepted a job in the mines, work as dangerous and exhausting as combat, though in a different way. The descent into the subsoil reminded him of certain passages of the war, with narrow tunnels, thick darkness, and the feeling that death could appear at any instant, whether from a collapse, accumulated gas, or a machinery accident. Day after day, he wielded tools as he had once held his rifle, and as the months passed, his body regained a certain physical strength, although the mental exhaustion never dissipated. Many colleagues were also ex-combatants, men who spoke little, who simply worked and returned to their homes without sharing much. The state granted him a military pension, a recognition that barely complemented his mine's salary. Even so, that money constantly reminded him that he had survived where so many had perished. Every time he received the payment, he felt a difficult-to-describe pang, as if that benefit were built upon the absence of others. The names of his dead friends appeared in his memory effortlessly, and the list was longer than he was able to pronounce out loud. On his days off, when exhaustion allowed it, he would often sit at the table in his small house and review a cardboard box where he kept the few things he had brought from the war. There were wrinkled photographs, stained letters, and some medals that did not shine as they did in the parades. Each object dragged him back to the past. An image of his battalion returned him to the trenches. A letter from a comrade made him hear again the voices of those who were no longer there, and a military insignia transported him to the parades where they marched with a steady step, believing they would all return. This ritual of opening the box and examining its contents became a silent custom, almost an act of resistance against forgetting. He did not seek company often. Most social gatherings were uncomfortable for him because conversations revolved around topics that were meaningless to him. While others talked about harvests, prices, or local celebrations, his mind wandered toward memories that no one wanted to hear. On more than one occasion he tried to explain what he had seen, but he soon understood that people preferred to look forward. Society needed to believe in a clean victory, in a reconstruction without shadows, and he represented the opposite, the living proof that the war did not end when the documents were signed. In the mines, some young men asked him to recount stories from the front. He responded with short phrases, almost always limiting himself to saying that it was hard, and that the important thing was that the country had resisted. He avoided going into details because he knew that a faithful narration would scare anyone away. However, upon arriving home, those same scenes he kept silent about returned with unbearable clarity, as if someone were projecting them into his memory without stopping. There was no night when he could sleep without startling awake, and many times he woke up soaked in sweat with the echo of gunshots in his ears. Solitude became his most constant companion. Even with family and acquaintances nearby, he felt apart, as if an invisible wall separated him from everyone. With time, he learned to live with that distance. understanding that between him and the rest there would always be a space that no one would know how to fill. That acceptance did not erase the pain, but it made it bearable. Years passed, and with them the routine of working underground and returning home with his body covered in dust. The military pension kept arriving, and with it new medals or diplomas that he barely glanced at before putting them away in a drawer. It wasn't that he despised them, but he did not see in them a true reflection of what he had lived through. For him, the decorations could not replace the faces of his lost comrades or the weight of the memories that accompanied him. Occasionally he received visits from former comrades from the front. These meetings were brief, laden with long silences and glances that said more than any word. They spoke of who had survived, who had disappeared, who had been left bedridden. They were conversations that were interrupted before they became unbearable, as if everyone understood that reopening the past too much was equivalent to bleeding again. It was during one of those long winters that he decided to begin writing down what he had lived through. Writing became an intimate necessity, not a public act. He only wanted to record what continued to weigh on him. He used simple sheets, sometimes pieces of recycled paper, and a worn-out pencil. He advanced slowly, fighting against the memory that resisted being ordered. Some sentences he crossed out immediately because they were unbearable to read, others were left unfinished and he returned to them weeks later. This effort became a second battle, more intimate but equally hard. With each page he felt that he was releasing a part of the accumulated weight, although he also confronted again scenes that he had tried to bury in his mind. The noise of the trains, the faces of the prisoners, the bodies of his friends, everything reappeared with clarity as he wrote it down. However, instead of stopping, he continued, convinced that the testimony had to be captured so that subsequent generations would understand the real price of victory. In that process, he received a visit from a young editor interested in compiling soldiers' memoirs. At first, he hesitated, fearing that his words would be manipulated or reduced to a simple patriotic account. But the editor's insistence and the promise to respect his voice convinced him. Thus, the papers he had written in solitude began to take the form of a book. The experience of reviewing and correcting what he had written led him to relive once again every step, every battle, every wound. But it also allowed him to organize his own story. The book was published with a discreet reception. Some read it with interest, others ignored it, but for him the important thing was to have left a mark. He knew that memory dissipates with time, and that recollections turn into figures or dates in history textbooks. His intention was different. He wanted the individual voices, those of the common soldiers, not to disappear amid the official speeches. Although he always remained somewhat distant by sharing his memories with the new generations, he found a way to reconcile with his own experience. Seeing the attention in the young eyes, he understood that at least for a moment his voice was truly heard. Over the years, his health gradually weakened. The work in the mine had left sequelae in his lungs, and the old war wounds constantly reminded him of his fragility. Even so, he maintained the determination to speak whenever someone asked him. In brief interviews or talks with students, he repeated a simple idea, that the war should not be forgotten, not to glorify it, but to understand the suffering it had left in millions of lives. And so, in the calm of his last years, he clearly defined the meaning of everything he had recounted. He did not seek recognition or applause, nor did he want to be seen as a hero. His objective was more humble and more human, to leave a record of what had happened so that the collective memory would not fade away in silence. As he said firmly at the end of his account, by telling it, "I do not seek glory. I just want them to remember it."